Well, thanks to everybody for coming. My name is Christopher Wolfe. I'm president of the American Public Philosophy Institute, and this is the annual Scherer Lecture and Conference. As you know, tonight at 8 o'clock, Father Joseph Katersky is going to be speaking on a practical moral vision for the American economy, and we hope to see many of you there tonight as well. We also take this occasion to have our advisory council come in for a meeting, and having that opportunity, we say, well, as long as they're here, why don't we take these distinguished scholars and have some of them be part of a conference and then invite other distinguished scholars and make a weekend of it. So we have a number of events tomorrow. At 9:30, Matthew Wilson from SMU will be speaking on attitudes of religious believers toward the welfare state. He does empirical political science at SMU. Dr. Susan Hansen of the University of Dallas will be speaking on the amazing American achievement of freedom in education. So that's at 9:30 and 10, and then discussion from 10:30 to 11. At 11 o'clock, we'll have a half-hour break. At 11:30, we'll have the distinguished philosopher John Haldane speaking on reasonable disagreement and civic friendship. It'll be from 11:30 to 12 with discussion for about half an hour after that. 12:30, we'll have then lunch, and at 2 o'clock, we'll have Professor Gerard Bradley of the University of Notre Dame speaking on religious liberty and the common good. So we have a great lineup. But the first event right now is we have very fortunate to have Mark Regnerus to speak. Mark is associate professor at the University of Texas at Austin in sociology. He's the author of over 30 published articles and book chapters. His research is largely in the area of sexual behavior, family, and religious behavior. Mark attended Trinity Christian College and then earned his MA and his PhD at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His books include Premarital Sex in America, Forbidden Fruit, Sex and Religion in the Lives of American Teenagers, and then coming out later this year, Cheap Sex, The Transformation of Men, Marriage, and Monogamy. He's also the author of some very widely discussed articles. One a while back in 2009 was an article about timing of the age of marriage. And it has become pretty much dogma in sociology that you really want to push the age of marriage off significantly. Many of you may know that the average age of marriage now is about 28 or 29. And that's quite a difference from the past. And Mark took a shot at that orthodoxy by suggesting that, well, we don't necessarily want people getting married at 17 or 18, but on the other hand, at 22, 23, 24, something that is not entirely uncommon at the University of Dallas, is not necessarily a bad idea, because it's not so much that you have to kind of wait until you're all grown up, completely matured, and then you get married. It's actually not so bad to actually mature, to have some of that maturing done with the person that you're spending your life with. So it was an interesting article and caused quite a bit of comment around the country. And then, of course, the granddaddy of controversy, in his case, was an article he did on new family structures in a journal called Social Science Research, a well-known sociology journal, in 2012. And it was basically research on outcomes in young people who had been raised in families where one person identified at some point as being gay. And that was an extraordinarily controversial article because it didn't come to the typical anodyne conclusion that, of course, it makes no difference. I mean, of course, hard to imagine how it cannot make any difference, right? But to actually say it, and then Mark also used a very wide population sample, which was unusual in this area, but it didn't stop the roof from falling in. So Mark will be talking a little about these things because his topic today is the challenge of doing research in controversial areas. And so it's great to have him. Thanks very much, Mark.
This looks like a taser. Good to be here. Thank you for the invitation. It's always good to be at the University of Dallas. I think it's my third trip here to give talks. It's good to see some people I know in the room, some people I was not expecting to see. So today I want to talk about how to do controversial research and what is going wrong about the academic environment and what is still okay and right enough that you can keep doing this. So we're seeing a lot lately about the trouble of difficult topics on campus, especially when it comes to like invited speakers or disinvited speakers, shouted down speakers, and all but tackled speakers and hair pulled speakers. And that's no doubt worth our attention. But today I want to focus on some of the stuff that comes before that causes the trouble that speakers who want to talk about these things wind up getting into. So, and I'm talking all about this as a social scientist, not a philosopher, not a political theorist. It seems to me, and I could be wrong about this, and I welcome contributions from the audience on this, that it's easier to write about controversial subjects as a philosopher or a political theorist than as a social scientist and maybe even as a natural scientist. I don't know. You can maybe help me figure this out. My good friend and my Catholic sponsor, Jay Budziszewski, my colleague at UT, I don't know why I get into more trouble than he does, because his language around sexuality is so much more punchy and poignant than mine ever has been. My hunch is it has to do with the story that social science, which is fed by social scientists, the story that we're dealing in facts and you other people are dealing in values or opinions. One can disagree with one about opinions, but somehow if the facts aren't straight, there must be some sort of deception, etc., and that deserves investigations of particular sorts that I am now familiar with. A misguided belief, though, in this is that there's a strong fact-value distinction that remains alive and well long after Max Weber is off the scene. But facts seldom lack values. Indeed, asking about the fact of gender identity on a survey, for example, is never neutral. It's never objective. It's a fact that is saturated by value. So, what I'm going to talk about is not meant to be a pity party. It is not meant to pat myself on the back. Although a few points I will utilize my own experience with as examples. It is not meant to lament, but to diagnose what is wrong and what is still right about doing research on controversial subjects. As with guest speakers and classroom conversations, it certainly would not be fair to assert that it is only conservatives who are feeling all this more poignantly, though that may be true in the sense that we're just rarer than liberals on campus. But it pays to remember that rejection is a common experience in the realm of research. It is not always, and it may not often be, sinister in its sources. So some of it is like, we're so used to rejection, I'm not sure what happened to our spine of late, because rejection is a part of being a scholar. So, what is wrong about the research process on controversial subjects? Okay, I have 7 points to make about what's wrong. It won't take me too long to make those. And then I have 5 points about what's still right. First, controversial subjects tend to be comparatively new subjects. New as in like maybe up to 30 years old. And new subject matter lends itself to problems. In his famous 2005 article entitled "Why Most Published Research Findings Are False," Stanford medical professor John Ioannidis detailed what it is that often causes problems. He cited flexibility in designs, definitions, outcomes, ways of analyzing, as well as the relative popularity of a particular research subject as key factors that are apt to weaken confidence in published research findings and elevate the risk of scientific missteps. So flexibility in designs, meaning like, we're not quite yet sure how to do this. We're not quite sure yet how to define this. In other words, he's saying there are few established protocols yet in some of these controversial subjects, even while there are premature consensuses forming. For example, we still have not agreed on how best to measure sexual orientation. Nor do scholars all agree that it actually exists. One well-read article by a Northwestern University professor is entitled, "What is Sexual Orientation and Do Women Have One?" Okay? It's actually a very interesting article. Should we be using the Kinsey scale? Or should we let people identify themselves to us and then we do the difficult work of kind of grouping together similar sounding identities? Or, as some activists now prefer, maybe we shouldn't be studying them at all. Some claim that after my 2012 article on same-sex parenting and child outcomes. They should not be studied as parents. So, first, controversial subjects tend to be comparatively new subjects. Second, Ioannidis goes on to identify an additional set of problems. With the rapid expansion of publication outlets and pressure to publish, this has contributed to a surge in scientific overstatements, errors, accusations of fabrications, and the issuing of errata and retractions, right? You take a look at Retraction Watch. It just monitors these things, right? Errata, which used to be rare, are becoming quite a bit more common now. And there's a renewed call for greater transparency, and I'll get to that later as something that's good. So it's often disconcerting to see what's published in the social sciences on the family, my angle, in part because I know these data sets so well, and I can see the tricks, the tweaks, commonly considered legitimate, that scholars employ to arrive at sanitized results. And so it is that one of the problems in research on controversial subjects is that at the same time as that there's troubles, is that there's a near explosion in the number of new journals, some of them somewhat dubious in origin. This is not to say that all the research that is published in them is dubious. It can be good research published right next to dubious research. We call these pay-to-publish journals, and they're sprouting like crazy because the journal production business is fairly profitable when they think about university subscriptions. All right. So the approach there is that it's more democratic, okay, in its publication standards than meritocratic, okay? I'm all for democracy, but when it comes to solid research, one wants to be meritocratic, that the best stuff is in. So the open source movement can be good. It exposes new ideas to the light of day, but it's not always good because it gives the veneer of respectability to plenty of substandard research. All right, so what else is wrong about the research process on controversial subjects? So we had first, second, third. Plenty of it is hard to actually replicate, and this is a problem. This too was pointed out by Professor Ioannidis. I think it's more of a problem in psychology, that's what he points at, than for sociology, and certainly than for economics. But then again, I think about much of what's most popular in sociology are ethnographic accounts, which are pretty much more or less believable based on the telling of the story and whether it comports with others' accounts or your account, rather than whether someone can make sense of your field notes, okay? So it's not, ethnography is not exactly a replicable approach. But even survey analyses are becoming difficult to replicate. When I originally published in 2012 my study on parental same-sex relationships, child outcomes, people cried foul for a dozen different reasons. But one of which was they questioned the veracity or the validity of the data, which I said I would release, and I did, even though it was privately funded and I was under no obligation to do so whatsoever. But I felt I had a moral obligation to release that data. Others do not perceive this moral obligation, unfortunately. And in very sensitive subject matters, controversial research, we're increasingly seeing people who aren't releasing publicly or privately funded data. One longitudinal study in particular has been going on for 25 years. It accounts for probably 20 different publications contributing to what is called the consensus in this domain, same-sex parenting. It is data that has never been shared outside of a tight network of people. I've asked for it. They won't give it to me. They don't have to give it to me. That is not good. And my colleagues know it, and they're not willing to do anything about it. So even when the data is available, and sometimes it's not always replicable either. Recently, starting about a year ago, a research assistant of mine and I attempted 10 different ways of replicating a Columbia University public health professor's study of general social survey data that you can analyze online. Every approach we tried failed to find any effect of what he said was anti-gay stigma, which I believe exists, okay? But he said it on average costs sexual minorities 12 years of lost life, the anti-gay stigma in your community, the attitudes that people around you hold, that you may not know, but that live around you. I thought this didn't make sense to me. I mean, smoking will take about a decade off of your life on average. How could the opinions of other people you don't know take 12 years off your life? I thought, well, this is worth at least exploring. So we did. I didn't set out to be a whistleblower. I set out to, after we replicate it, let's examine some alternative explanations for this study. Unfortunately, the fact that it took 2 years for someone to even decide that this might be worth replicating, which is a publicly available data set, already tells you that there's something wrong, right? We found no effect whatsoever. We could not replicate the key finding and the reason it got published in a top journal in an issue that the author himself co-edited. I don't really know if it's a peer-reviewed journal. I don't know if that particular article was peer-reviewed or not. All I know is that as soon as ours came out, one of his colleagues said, you know, I never thought that one was, that one smelled fishy to me in the first place. I said, do you think it'll be retracted? He said, no, don't worry, that's not going to get retracted. It's frustrating. So, but it bespeaks that there's groupthink out there, and that's clouding scholars' better judgment when it comes to controversial issues. The thing is, my colleagues know better, right? And they also know better than to say anything. Another brief example is decades ago when I was in graduate school doing piecemeal work for a professor. She was hell-bent on telling a particular story, particularly unlikely story, with the data that I was analyzing, and she ordered me to keep torturing the data until it told the story that she wanted to hear. It never happened, okay? No matter what I did, it was not going to happen, but she wanted the data to say what she wanted to say. I want to know the truth about things in the social world. Ideological opponents of mine say I can't handle the truth. And so they say, I am ignoring mountains of social science data that doesn't comport with my biased vision. I say it's hogwash. The truth is never a threat. The truth can be depressing, but it's still the truth, and I want to know it. I want to understand it. But I don't think a lot of it is being spoken, written, analyzed. So, fourth, I have found troubling that your personal motivations matter to others in the guild. They shouldn't, but they do. Another story. Several years ago, I wrote a short piece for Public Discourse, which is an online essay collection that Witherspoon Institute publishes. It's not an academic journal. It's not peer-reviewed, typically speaking, nor do I cite my work that appears there. But in this piece, I had analyzed data on the influence of pornography use on men's support for same-sex marriage. Like, that's different, okay? I had a theory about how the connection between the two might work, and I tested it using the data, and it was quite strong and obvious that for men, not for women, that for men, the more porn they consumed, the greater they were on board with the concept of same-sex marriage. And this was a few years before it became law in the United States. So, Public Discourse, Ryan Anderson decided this is good, we should publish this, and so they did. At the same time, I just didn't feel like expanding it by 12 to 15 pages and adding a longer literature review and running it through the review process. I just wanted to write a 3 or 4 page thing and get it out there and move on to something else. So I wasn't seeking to publish it as an article. Short piece. I must be on some people's Google News alerts, though, because within a day or two, the blogosphere was complaining, and the Huffington Post launched a salvo in my direction saying that the idea I was floating was just outrageous, ridiculous, that porn could somehow socialize men by repeated exposure to diverse sex acts, to the idea that homosexual sex is simply no big deal, and therefore so is same-sex marriage. I didn't find the idea that hard to believe as a theory. And frankly, it was what the data was saying. Now, that's not the humorous part or the sad part, depends on how you perceive that. That happened about a month later when I learned that another study, this one peer-reviewed using a different nationally representative data set, the General Social Survey, was published in a journal with the exact same findings using the exact same theory. Okay? When I asked, or when the author of that study was asked in an interview to explain the connection between porn and same-sex attitudes, marriage attitudes, the lead author of that study, a communications professor at Indiana University, said that, quote, pornography adopts an individualistic, non-judgmental stance on all kinds of non-traditional sexual behaviors. It's true. And he added that since a portion of individuals' sexual attitudes come from the media they consume, it makes sense that pornography viewers would have more positive attitudes towards same-sex marriage. Okay? That's what his study said. It wasn't that much different from what I had said in Public Discourse, where I had concluded with the observation, quote, contrary to what we might wish to think, young adult men's support for redefining marriage may not be entirely the product of ideals about expansive freedoms, rights, liberties, noble commitment to fairness and equality. It might be, in part, a byproduct of their regular exposure to diverse and graphic sex acts. So I was feeling rather gratified that others had seen what I saw in the data. That's how science works, okay? I didn't mind that Huffington Post was angry at me, but not at him. All was fine for a couple days. And then I get an unsolicited email from the author of that study, Dr. Regnerus. I was unaware of your research and its associated controversy until a few days ago when the popular press picked up my study of predictors of support for same-sex marriage. I am an LGBT advocate and have published research to this effect. Given our divergent motivations for studying this issue and the controversy surrounding your research, I'm writing to request that you remove mention of me and my study from your blog. If you will not do that, I ask that you at least post this email to your blog so that readers can understand the differing perspectives from which we approached this issue. Thank you, sincerely yours, the author. I'm not entirely sure why, but that one letter bothered me far longer than all the harassing blogs and newspaper articles, etc., that I had endured for a while. Those were frontal assaults from bloggers and pseudo-journalists. But this, a fairly simple complaint, threw me for a loop for a while, because it made me realize that it doesn't matter what data you analyze, what you hypothesize, and what you conclude. It can be the same things as your people who don't like you. What mattered was who I am. Are you an insider or an outsider? And how my motivations were perceived. Was I friendly to this political project, or was I not? It wasn't the politicization of social science. The methods, even the theoretical thinking, remained comparable. Our results were virtually identical, and we offered similar explanations. This is the politicization of social scientists, not science. Sociologists, and certainly scholars in other disciplines as well, assume a particular kind of good that formally goes unspoken. They lean on a shared social and moral compass. It's not surprising. It's practically standard group dynamics. But it is nevertheless one of the graver challenges we face, I think, in the conduct of research that reaches unpopular conclusions. And it is profoundly exacerbated by the coarseness and immediacy of online evaluators. In fact, the American Psychological Association issued an opinion about my 2012 study on their homepage within 2 days of when it was published. They hadn't seen the data. I hadn't given the data out yet. 2 days. That's wrong. That's not how science works. It's also why groups like Heterodox Academy, that Jonathan Haidt have started, are important representations, indicators that scientists and scholars are in this project for the pursuit of truth together, not balkanized into tribes that cannot even talk to each other, even while they're finding the exact same thing. So when that research assistant of mine reached out to the Columbia Public Health professor for help in accounting for the differences between his study and what we were finding in our attempts to replicate it, she was not met with explanations. She was asked questions about our motivations. After that, silence. Fifth problem, a key challenge to research on controversial subjects is that many of the subjects themselves are becoming kind of less controversial because the ground is shifting in terms of what scholars even consider good anymore. Health and happiness and finishing a college education are becoming the primary measures of the good life. Psychological difficulty, completely normal. More sexual partners, fine. Experience of trauma, join the club. Sexually transmitted infection, who hasn't had one of those? Underemployment, happens. Broken home, get in line. Cheer up, doesn't matter. Outcomes are being normalized, not as dysfunctional or even as unideal, but as predictable hoops that the average person will have to navigate. Hence, to motivate research based on suboptimal outcomes is actually becoming more difficult. I mean, typically speaking, we motivate research by saying, these things matter because of things that we can agree are true. But if we can't agree that those things are true, it's becoming more difficult to motivate basic research. And this is because the scholarly class has elected to normalize problematic experiences, including problematic experiences that plenty of them do not experience. Sixth problem out of 7, and directly related to that previous point. The arc of Western social science is devoid of a compelling anthropology of personhood and community. It just is. What are people is a question they black box. If they answer it at all, they say whatever they want to be. What people ought to do is answered with whatever they wish to do, so long as no immediate or significant harm is done to themselves or to those immediately around them. Those are all answers that don't bode well for the long-term sustainable reproduction of flourishing human societies. It reminds me of I think he's a Dominican, or was, A.G. Sertalange, wrote that famous book. Quoting the historian Paul Johnson, he warned that intellectuals as a class may well be evolving theories and explanations precisely as a product of their own internal moral disorders. They're not even going to see clearly, so how would we expect them to conclude clearly? In different disciplines, there is variation in how out of step your research can be. In sociology, it is not very difficult to be saying things that are well out of the mainstream, but yet may be very reasonably defended. Finally, on the problems, there are variable costs to conducting such research. I consider myself as actually having escaped the worst possibilities, in part by remaining calm and continuing to do your work. Others have not escaped more problematic outcomes. Some have been terminated, demoted, lost privileges, etc. People think I had it bad. I know others who are now enduring worse challenges, all of it undeserved. People ask, do you have tenure? I say, yes. And they think, oh, good, you're in good shape, okay? You're protected. Well, protection is a latent variable, we call that, with many aspects. Tenure shields some of that, but other aspects of one's position become fully exposed, fully exploited by opportunistic enemies, or even scared colleagues and friends. So that's what's wrong. There are some things that are still right, though. What is right about the research process on controversial subjects? First, you can call me naive, but I still believe that the peer review process generally works. If you budget for patience and you allow for some normal rejections, which has long been the case, whether one writes on controversial subjects or mundane ones. The peer review process can and does frustrate me, but it did so when I was in graduate school writing on normal things. It frustrates my colleagues too. Hence, it must be working. More reasons for optimism, at least personally. My failure to replicate study was published, and in the same journal in which the Columbia Public Health professor published his study. His study should be retracted, but it probably won't. But I take heart in knowing that it got published in the same place because the editors of that journal, who had appointed him as an associate editor of the journal, still cared about truth and they believed what I was saying. It also warms my heart that I am still asked to review submissions for these kinds of journals. I actually don't have a chip on my shoulder towards solid research that openly contests things that I have written. I just haven't seen many yet. Editors could be too intimidated to go against the grain. I have seen that happen. But many editors are also committed to scholarly rigor. And plenty of research on controversial subjects is simply not very rigorous. Indeed, it remains evident to me that when I think about the social scientific study of same-sex households and child outcomes, very little of it is published in high-quality journals, and that matters. Second, there is growing demand for greater openness. It's a good thing. In light of all this replication problems, more scholarly journals are requesting or at least allowing the addition of supplementary material online, enabling scholars to evaluate those findings. So when I published this failure to replicate study, we added supplementary information, which is all of our coding, so that people could take it, go get that data, and see how we got our answers. In light of the growing number of scientific studies whose results are not replicable, more scholarly journals are improving disciplinary rigor in these kinds of ways. So, greater openness. Third reason for optimism. At least in my domain of research, there's actually resistance to avoiding data collection. Okay? There's resistance to avoiding data collection, because I told you a little while ago, some people don't want to be studied. And so there's actually open movements to not measure particular things. I think in Canada, if I'm not mistaken, they have stopped measuring marriage on the census. There was a move afoot to stop measuring marriages on the US Census. And my colleagues, plenty of whom didn't like what I said, went to bat against that movement. Gratefully, I added my name to it too. More data is good. So when recently the New York Times featured a one-sided debate about whether it was okay to change the sex on your birth certificate, and they wondered, why do we collect data on sex on individuals anyway? Sex as in male, female. When activists tried to end that, better judgment prevailed. Fourth out of 5, there is still academic freedom, though it is a little more tenuous of late, and there are costs, but there are benefits to academic freedom. I learned that you can survive controversy. You can operate amid hostility. Sometimes you'll notice, especially I think at administrative levels in colleges. I saw this at the University of Missouri when things went crazy there a couple of years ago. Immediately their president resigned and the provost or the vice president resigned. And I thought, when I saw that, it's like, what spinelessness? You know, I will not leave until they throw me out and survive a lawsuit. I don't understand why people are quick to leave amid controversy. Another thing that's positive about this is when you realize that your professional status in your discipline has likely peaked, it can be strangely freeing. I concern myself much less today with what my peers think than I did 10 years ago. My desire to pursue the truth is more single-minded than it used to be. It's less subject to peer pressure. And that is actually what academic freedom and tenure are supposed to be for. I think we forget about that. Too many of us consider it basic job security that is afforded to no one else in the world except us because somehow we deserve it. It has a purpose. It was created to sustain the pursuit of the truth wherever it happens to lead us. Fifth and finally, it may be the case that research on controversial subjects is actually easier than teaching about those subjects. This is more of a comparative advantage than an absolute one. Basically, I think it's easier to conduct research on controversial subjects, at least at present, than it is to teach about them sometimes in the classroom, especially if you are not saying what your students wish for you to say. This may not have always been the case, but it seems to be the case for now. There are orthodoxies wherever you go. There's one here, there's one at the University of Texas, etc. And those orthodoxies are enforced more when they emerge, I think, from your mouth than they do from your pen. You could disagree with me, but it has worked out that way for me. I don't have a great many strategies about living the academic life in a secular university, but one of them is certainly to use my writing as the most obvious place for a wider authenticity, and to use the classroom a little bit more sparingly for the basics. I teach intro to sociology. I teach intro to research methods. I don't teach sociology of marriage and the family, in part because I've decided I'd rather have problems out there in the blogosphere than in here in the classroom and with the administration, so to speak. And partly because at UT, the development of campus speech police seems to be accelerating even as of past week. I have not yet been written up for a bias incident, but since it is utterly subjective what a bias incident is, I suspect my time is coming. So, in sum, on the pursuit of controversial research, I think Robbie George is right about freedom of inquiry and speech. These are like muscles. If you don't use them, they atrophy. In our case, if you don't write it, if you don't say it, if you don't study it, it only accelerates the time until you can do none of those things openly. So, thank you. And time for questions. Am I taking questions?